The kingdom Protista is kind of like the leftover kingdom. You can kind of think about it like if it's not a plant, an animal, a fungus, or a bacteria, then they're going to put it in the kingdom Protista. So it's sort of all the leftovers of organisms that you're not quite sure where else they're going to go. There's several characteristics that are common among the kingdom. First, everything in the kingdom is eukaryotic, which means it has a nucleus. Nothing is prokaryotic. The only thing that's prokaryotic are bacteria. Those are in other kingdoms. Everything in the kingdom Protista has a cell wall. In general, there are a few exceptions, and we'll see a couple of those, but in general, they must have a cell wall. They can either be multicellular organisms or unicellular organisms. And they can't be both. Everything is either multicellular or unicellular, but both kinds of organisms can be put into this kingdom. And everything in kingdom Protista is either autotrophic or heterotrophic. Autotrophic meaning it makes its own food through something like photosynthesis, or heterotrophic meaning it has to consume food to get energy. Now, protists are put into three main groups, and this is based on how they obtain their energy. They're either going to be called animal-like protists, plant-like protists, or fungus-like protists. If they're heterotrophic and they have to eat food to survive, they'll be called animal-like. If they're autotrophic, meaning that they can perform photosynthesis or make their own food in some other process, then they're called plant-like protists. And if they're decomposers, meaning that they are heterotrophic, they have to get their energy from somewhere else, but they don't eat necessarily, they decompose things like rotting wood or dead material, they'll be called fungus-like protists, because fungus typically are decomposers. So let's take a look at some from each of these groups. We'll start with our animal-like protists. We've got a few examples here. The amoeba is a type of protist that captures food by surrounding the food and taking it in as a food vacuole. This is a unicellular organism. The amoeba is right here. So what it does is it sort of takes its arms and envelops the food and then pulls it inside of its cell membrane, and the food comes in as a vacuole, which is a storage unit in the cell. Next we have our paramecium. Paramecium move around by using these little short hairs. They're hair-like projections, and those are called cilia. So we can look over here at this picture. You can see the cilia on the outside. That's how the paramecium will move around. And it flaps those little things kind of like oars on a boat so that they can move. And then we have plasmodium, which is a type of protist that actually causes the disease malaria, and it lives in the saliva of mosquitoes. So the plasmodium, actually we don't have a picture of, but it is transmitted by mosquitoes and is responsible for the disease malaria. Now we have some plant-like protists. Our plant-like protists typically contain chlorophyll, so they're usually green, and they can typically perform photosynthesis, although sometimes they don't. The first one we're going to look at is the euglena. The euglena is a type of algae that has a flagella, and it actually is one of the ones that doesn't have a cell wall. So here's a picture of a euglena. Notice it's green because it has the chlorophyll so that it can produce photosynthesis, so it can make its own food. So it would be an autotroph because it makes its own food. Then we've got red, brown, or green algae. And algae is going to actually look a lot like a plant, but the thing that makes it different from a plant is that all of its cells are exactly the same. So in a plant cell, you've got different kinds of cells in the leaves and the stem and the roots. They're not all the same. But in this protist, this algae, they are the same. So here's a picture of a school of fish swimming by some brown algae. You can see how big it is. It really does look like a plant. But when you look at each individual cell, they're all exactly the same. Alright, then the last one we have in this group are the diatoms. And diatoms have cell walls, and their cell walls have a lot of silicon in them. And silicon is used in polishes, polishing compounds that you buy in the store, and also to make some types of paint sparkle, like in the paint that they put on automobiles can have some of these diatoms in it to make it sparkle a little bit. This is a microscopic picture of some diatoms. You can notice how pointy and angular they are. They're actually very beautiful, but this is what makes things sparkle. And then we have some fungus-like protists. These protists are going to absorb nutrients from dead or decaying matter. So they are heterotrophs, but they're more specifically decomposers. The first one we have are slime molds. Slime molds are typically found in mulch beds, like beds of all this decaying material. And here's a picture of a slime mold. This one's a yellow slime mold, growing on some decaying leaves, it looks like, on the floor of a forest. Then the next one we have is the water molds. And water molds grow on decaying matter that's found in water. And water molds are actually responsible for the Irish potato famine that happened in the 1800s, where a lot of potato farmers from Ireland had to come over to the United States to find work and food. So it contaminated all of these potatoes and caused this famine. Here's a picture of a potato infected with a water mold. So these are some examples of some protists that you might be familiar with.